The map had a hole in it. Not a blank spot. Not an uncharted region where the data simply ran out. Those existed at the galaxy's edges, places no one had bothered to survey. This was different. This was a carved-out wound in the middle of known space, a region that every species had agreed to pretend did not exist. On every star chart, in every language, across every database maintained by the 4,200 species of the Galactic Concord, the same glyph sat over that region of space, like a scar. Voided. Ambassador Ven Serrata stared at it, the way she had stared at it every morning for 3 weeks. She sat in her tiny office, in the historical compliance wing of the Concord's central station, a wing so forgotten that the cleaning drones had stopped visiting 2 cycles ago. Dust floated in the amber light. Her wing scales floated with it, small translucent flakes that drifted off her back when she was stressed. She was always stressed now. She tapped the glyph. The system returned the same result it always returned. No associated files, no treaty records, no incident reports, no judicial rulings. Nothing. Every other voided zone in the galaxy had documentation. Zone 11K, near the Pelori Rift, had 9,000 pages explaining a radiation anomaly. Zone 33R, in the Outer Arm, had a full war tribunal record. 6 species held accountable, reparations tracked for 2 centuries. Even the smallest voided zones, the ones covering dead rocks and collapsed stars, had paperwork. The Concord loved paperwork, the way oceans loved holding water. It was what they were made of. Saul had nothing. Ven pulled up the navigation exclusion order. It existed, technically. A single line in the Concord's master routing table, embedded so deep in the code that most navigation officers never saw it. Their ships simply routed around the region the way a river routes around a stone, so naturally that no one thought to ask why. The exclusion had no author, no date stamp, no sponsoring species. It was as if the order had always been there, written into the architecture of the system before the system was built. She had asked about it. That was her first mistake. Her supervisor, a Thessari named Counselor Dran, had blinked all 4 of his eyes in a pattern that Ven had learned meant deep discomfort. He told her to focus on her assigned caseload. She asked again the next day. He reassigned 2 of her cases and suggested she take a rest cycle. She asked a 3rd time, and he called her into his office and sat across from her in silence for a long time, his massive aquatic body shifting in his water chair, before saying something she did not expect. "You were placed in this office to be forgotten, Ambassador. I suggest you let yourself be." She had been reassigned to historical compliance after embarrassing a senior Concord minister at a public summit. The minister had made a claim about trade routes in Ven's home sector. The claim was wrong. Ven corrected him. She was polite about it. She had data. She was right, and everyone in the room knew she was right, and the minister smiled the way powerful people smile when they've already decided to make you disappear. 2 days later, she was transferred. No hearing, no formal complaint, just a new office in a dead wing and a caseload of 200-year-old filing errors. So when she found the hole in the map, she did not feel curiosity. She felt recognition. She knew what it looked like when something true got buried, because it made the wrong people uncomfortable. She started pulling threads. The formal data requests came back empty. The navigation logs from the region's border showed ships rerouting, but no records of why. She cross-referenced fleet movements from 300 years ago and found a gap, a 6-month window, where the Concord's combined fleet, a largest military force in galactic history, had been fully mobilized and then fully stood down with no corresponding conflict in the record. 40,000 ships, moved and returned. No war, no exercise, no explanation. She requested interviews with senior diplomats. 11 agreed, 9 canceled within a day. The 2 who showed up gave her the same answer in different words. The arrangement. When she asked what the arrangement was, they both did the same thing. They looked past her, at something that wasn't in the room, and then they left. Ven's wing scales were falling like snow now. She swept them off her desk every hour and pretended her hands were steady. On the 22nd day of her investigation, a message arrived on her personal channel. No sender identification. No subject line. Just coordinates and a time. She went. The coordinates led to a medical ward on the station's lower rings, a place for species nearing the end of their biological terms. The room was dim and smelled of calcium and old water. In a suspension cradle near the window lay a druosy. Ancient, enormous, his crystalline shell cracked in dozens of places and filled with slow-growing moss that his species cultivated in their final years. His name was Torvan. He was, according to station records, 431 years old. He had been alive when the map was whole. Ven sat beside him. She did not speak first. Among the druosy, the dying chose when to give their words. Rushing them was like stealing from a temple. Torvan watched her for a while. His eyes, deep amber set in cracked crystal, moved over her face, her wings, the tiny scales that drifted from her shoulders. His voice sounded like gravel shifting at the bottom of a lake. I'm stressed. Yes, he seemed to find this satisfying. You found the hole. I found the hole. And you want to know what filled it. Then leaned forward. I want to know why it's empty. Torvan made a sound that might have been a laugh, a deep, wet, geological sound. Then he said the thing that broke her understanding of the galaxy clean in half. We didn't void their space, child. They voided ours. He let that sit. Ven's wings locked against her back. The Concord sent 40,000 ships to a system on the inner arm, Torvan said. 40,000, 11 species, full extermination mandate. He paused. The moss in his cracks pulsed faintly. 9 seconds. 9 seconds what? That's how long it lasted. He reached beneath his cradle, with a limb that trembled with the effort, and produced a data chip. Old format. The kind that hadn't been manufactured in 2 centuries. He held it out to her. One file, he said. A distress signal. 9 seconds long. 40,000 ships. Ven took the chip. It was warm from his body heat. I've carried that for a very long time, Torvan said. He closed his eyes. It's yours now. She went back to her office. She locked the door. She swept the wing scales off her console. She inserted the chip. 9 seconds. It started with voices. Dozens of species talking over each other. The clipped bark of military communication breaking down into something raw. Ship loss alarms. The kind that only trigger when a vessel stops existing. Not damaged. Not disabled. Gone. The alarms layered on top of each other, until the sound was a wall of shrieking code. Then, beneath it all, a sound she could not name. Low, structural, not mechanical and not organic. It sounded like the space itself was exhaling, a slow, vast breath being released by something that had been holding it for a very long time. Then, nothing. Then sat in the silence. On the floor around her chair, a ring of wing scales glittered in the amber light like shed snow. Her assistant stood in the doorway. His own scales covered the threshold. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing in their languages for what they had just heard. Counselor Ref Mahan had not slept in 4 days. This was not unusual for a Thessari. His species could function for weeks on partial rest, their aquatic brains cycling through sleep in sections, the way a city dims its lights, district by district. But Reth was not cycling. He was fully, brutally awake, every section of his mind lit and burning, because a young Cathari diplomat with molting wings had just pulled the pin on a grenade he had spent 40 years sitting on. He watched her through the surveillance feed in his office. She was in the historical compliance wing, hunched over her console, playing the 9-second signal for the 4th time. Each time she played it, she got quieter. That was the correct response. People who got louder after hearing it did not understand what they were hearing. People who went silent did. Reth turned off the feed and looked at the wall. He had been 26 when he first heard the signal. A junior intelligence analyst, so new to the Concorde's security apparatus that his clearance badge still smelled of fabrication chemicals. His superior had played it during a classified briefing and then watched the room the way a doctor watches a patient after delivering bad news. 3 analysts had requested transfers that week. 1 had resigned entirely. Reth had stayed. He had stayed because he wanted to understand. 40 years later, he understood. He wished he didn't. His secure terminal chimed. A notification from the records division. Automatic. Triggered by access flags he had set decades ago. Someone had requested the fleet deployment records from standard year 4712. The request had been denied by the system, as it always was, but the attempt itself was logged. Then Sarada, again. Reth opened the sealed file on his personal archive and looked at the deployment order he had memorized 30 years ago. The kind of language that made atrocities feel like accounting. Authorization, Combined Fleet Action 4712-01. Objective, complete biological neutralization of Sol origin sapient species, Class 9 adaptive threat. Fleet composition, 40,000 vessels, 11 contributing species. Authorized by Concorde General Vote. Standard year 4712, day 88. Vote result, 4,187 in favor, 13 opposed. Duration of deliberation, 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Reth had done the math once in the early years, when the numbers still had the power to make him sick. 11 minutes to decide that an entire species should stop existing. The vote had been taken between a trade dispute involving mineral rights in the Pelori Rift and a budget allocation for a new communications relay. Humanity's extinction was item 7 on a 14-item agenda. The 13 species that voted against were small, peripheral. Their objections were logged as noted and nothing more. One of those species was the Cathari. Then's people had tried to save humanity, and they had been outvoted by a margin so vast it barely registered as dissent. He wondered if she knew that. He suspected she was about to find out. Reth made a decision. He had been making it for years, really, the way a cliff makes the decision to crumble long before the first rock falls. He logged into the records division under his senior clearance and lifted the access restriction on the fleet deployment files. Not all of them, just enough. The deployment order, the fleet composition, the vote record, and the human response. He wanted her to find it. He needed someone else to carry this. His body was failing, his water lungs thick with calcium deposits that his physicians described with careful optimism and he recognized as a death sentence delivered in installments. He did not have the years left to keep sitting on the grenade. But he could hand it to someone young enough and angry enough to throw it. Then found the unsealed files 6 hours later. She read the deployment order first. Reth watched her on the feed. Her wings went rigid, pressed flat against her back, the way her species locked their bodies when processing something that threatened to overwhelm their nervous system. Wing scales fell in a steady rain around her chair. She read the vote record. 4,187 to 13. 11 minutes. Her hands stopped moving over the console. She sat very still. Reth had seen this before, in the analysts who stayed. The stillness was not calm. It was the body refusing to move until the mind decided whether to break or hold. Then held. She read the fleet composition next. 40,000 ships, from 11 species, organized into attack groups with designations that sounded like filing codes. Attack Group Orek, Attack Group Besh. The names were alphabetical. The fleet that was sent to kill every human being alive was organized with the same care and creativity as a supply chain. Then she found the human response. It was a single file, transmitted on all frequencies, in all 4,200 Concorde languages simultaneously. The translation was perfect in every one of them, which meant the humans had taken the time to learn every language in the Concord before responding. This fact alone, Reth knew, had terrified the intelligence community more than anything that came after. The file contained 3 words. "You're welcome to try." Then stared at her screen. Reth watched her stare. The seconds stretched. He counted them out of old habit, the way he counted everything now, because a species he had never met had taught him that seconds mattered. Then Ven laughed. It started small, a sharp exhale through her mandibles, almost a cough. Then it grew. Wing scales scattered. She pressed her hands flat on her console and laughed with her whole body, the kind of laughter that lives next door to screaming and shares a wall so thin you can hear everything. Reth nodded. He had laughed too, the first time. The laughter had a reason, though neither of them could have explained it clearly. It was the absurdity of the scale. 4,187 species, 40,000 warships, 11 minutes of deliberation, and the target of all that collective, bureaucratic, well-organized murder had responded with 3 words that sounded like a dare scribbled on a bathroom wall. The gap between the Concord's monumental seriousness and humanity's 3-word reply was so vast that the only sane response was to laugh or to scream, and laughing felt closer to the truth. Because the 3 words were not bravado. Reth had understood this eventually, after years of turning them over. They were not a threat or a bluff. They were an invitation extended with full knowledge of what would happen when it was accepted. The humans knew what was coming. They knew they could stop it, and they said, "Welcome." That word, that specific word, it was the one that kept Reth awake at night. Ven stopped laughing. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing wing scales across her cheek like glitter at a funeral. She sat up straight and opened the next file in the sequence, the one Reth had unsealed last, the one labeled with a designation that had no equivalent in Concord filing taxonomy. Human Response File, Post-Contact. It should have contained a surrender, a negotiation, a plea, a final transmission from a species that knew it was about to die. Every other species targeted for neutralization in Concord history had produced something in this category. The Valori had sent poetry. The Droon had sent mathematical proofs, as if beauty could be used as a shield. The Ashkari had sent nothing, which the Concord had interpreted as acceptance. The Human Response File contained one additional line, appended to the original 3-word message. It had been added after the fleet launched, after 40,000 ships had committed to their trajectory, after the point of no return. Bring enough. Then read it twice. Then she closed the file, stood up, walked to the small washroom attached to her office, and was sick. Reth turned off the surveillance feed. He had seen enough. The grenade was in her hands now, and she was holding it the way he had hoped she would. Not with fear, not with outrage, with recognition. He opened his personal log and recorded a single entry, the first in 11 years. She knows. She's ready. I am not, and never was. The point was finding someone who would carry it forward instead of burying it deeper. The girl laughed when she read the 3 words. That's the test. That's always been the test. The ones who laugh are the ones who understand that what the humans did was not war. It was something we still don't have a word for, and the absence of that word is the hole in the map. He closed the log. He leaned back in his water chair and felt the calcium in his lungs shift like sand at the bottom of an hourglass. In her office, Ven Sarada sat on the floor among her own shed scales and stared at the wall and thought about 11 minutes, about how long that was, about how short that was, about a species she had never met that had been sentenced to death in the time it took to approve a budget line and had answered with 2 words that contained more dignity than the entire 4,000 species Concord had ever managed to produce in 11,000 years of recorded history. Welcome. Enough. She said them out loud, in her own language, and they tasted like something she recognized from childhood. A flavor she could not name. Something her grandmother used to say, before telling stories about the old wars, the ones her people had almost lost. The word, she realized, was defiance. But that wasn't quite right either. What follows is reconstructed from black box recordings recovered from the 1,204 surviving vessels of Combined Fleet Action 4712-01. The recordings were sealed by Concord Military Command immediately upon recovery, and have remained classified for 312 standard years. They are presented here in sequence. Fleet Commander Yidris of the Thessari Third Dominion sat in the command cradle of the Resolve of Tides, and watched Sol grow larger in the forward display. A yellow star. Ordinary. The kind of star that astronomers catalogued and forgot. Around it, 8 planets, a mess of moons, and a belt of broken rock that suggested the system had once tried to build a 9th planet and given up. Somewhere on the 3rd rock, and on stations scattered through the system, lived approximately 11 billion human beings. Not for long. Yidris reviewed the fleet disposition for the 3rd time that morning. 40,000 ships, arranged in a standard extinction formation, the kind the Concorde had used 4 times before against species designated Class 9. The formation was shaped like a closing fist, 12 attack groups sweeping inward from all vectors, leaving no corridor for escape. It was efficient. It was proven. It was, Yidris thought, probably unnecessary. The humans had possessed faster-than-light travel for barely 60 years. Their largest warship was the size of a Concorde patrol corvette. Intelligence estimated their total military capacity at somewhere between laughable and irrelevant. But the orders were clear. Full biological neutralization. No negotiations, no terms. The vote had passed, the fleet had launched, and in approximately 4 hours, the human species would be a historical footnote filed between the Valori manuscripts and the Drune proofs. Item 7 on a 14-item agenda, resolved. Idris did not enjoy this. He was a career officer who had served the Concorde for 80 years, and in that time he had learned that the galaxy was not a kind place, and that the Concorde's job was to keep it orderly. Humanity had been assessed, classified, and scheduled for removal by minds far above his rank. His job was the mechanics. He thought about his daughter. Her emergence ceremony was in 6 days. He would make it back in time if the operation stayed on schedule. The fleet crossed the boundary of human-claimed space at 1100 hours, standard Concorde time. Nothing happened. Idris had expected something. A transmission, perhaps. A desperate plea. A final act of defiance from a species that knew what was coming. Intelligence had warned that humans were unpredictable, prone to dramatic gestures, the kind of species that might ram a single ship into the fleet's lead element just to make a point. He had prepared for that. He had not prepared for silence. The fleet moved deeper, past the outer marker buoys, past a small research station that appeared abandoned, past a gas giant with a ring system that caught the light of Sol and threw it across the fleet's hulls in bands of gold. The ships sailed through beauty and silence, and the silence began to itch. At 1140 hours, the fleet reached the orbit of the 4th planet. Mars, the humans called it. A cold red world, with thin air and old dust. Scans showed structures on the surface. Cities. Empty. Yidris frowned. He ordered deep scans of the inner system. The 3rd planet, Earth, showed the same readings. Cities. Infrastructure. 11 billion life signs accounted for. But no ships. No defense platforms. No orbital weapons. No military response of any kind. "They're not fighting," his tactical officer said. The officer was Pellery, an insectoid species with compound eyes that tracked 17 data feeds simultaneously. All 17 feeds showed the same thing. Nothing. "They're not running either," Yidris said. The fleet pushed inward, past Mars, past the belt of broken rocks. into the space between the fourth planet and the third, the space where Earth hung blue and white and impossibly fragile against the black. At 11:47 hours, the first ship disappeared. Not destroyed. The resolve of Tide's sensors did not register an explosion, an impact, or an energy discharge. The ship, a Cathari light cruiser on the fleet's outer edge, simply stopped being where it was. Its transponder signal, which had been broadcasting continuously for the entire approach, cut off between one pulse and the next. One moment the ship existed in three-dimensional space. The next moment, the space it had occupied did not appear to be three-dimensional anymore. Idris stared at his display. The icon representing the Cathari cruiser was gone. Not destroyed. The system had no classification for what had happened. The icon simply was not there. "Report," he said. Before the word finished leaving his mouth, 46 more ships vanished. Then 300. Then 2,000. The disappearances were not random. They followed a pattern that Idris's tactical systems could detect, but not interpret. Ships vanished in clusters that mapped to geometric shapes his computers did not have names for. The shapes folded inward, and the ships inside them folded with them. And the space where the shapes had been became something that his navigation systems refused to acknowledge as space. His navigation officer started screaming, not in fear, in confusion. The star charts were rewriting themselves in real time. Coordinates that had been valid seconds ago now pointed to locations that did not connect to each other in any logical sequence. A ship that was 200 kilometers to port was now, according to every instrument on the resolve of Tides, also directly behind them, and also inside them, and also nowhere. Idris understood, in the space between two heartbeats, what was happening. The humans had not built weapons. They had built the space itself. Every station, every colony, every piece of infrastructure the Concorde had catalogued and dismissed as primitive, was not built in space, it was built into space. The humans had spent their 60 years of FTL capability not building a navy, but rewriting the underlying geometry of their territory. The stars were where they had always been. The planets were where they had always been. But the space between them, the fabric that connected point to point, was not the Concorde's space anymore. It was theirs, and they had just stopped sharing. Jump points collapsed like closing eyes. Attack Group Aurek, 1,200 ships, found themselves occupying a region of space that was now approximately the size of a single ship. The compression was instantaneous. 1,200 vessels folded into a volume that could hold one, and the physics of that folding was so clean, so precise, that there was no explosion, no debris, just absence. Attack Group Besh fired. Every weapon in the group discharged simultaneously. A wall of directed energy that should have sterilized a continent. The energy left the weapons, traveled 14 kilometers, curved and returned to its point of origin. Besh killed itself with its own guns. The geometry of the space they occupied had been folded into a loop. Firing outward meant firing inward. The fleet was not in a battle. It was in a box, and the walls of the box were made of mathematics. Idris opened a fleet-wide channel to order a retreat. His voice went out. The signal propagated at light speed through space that no longer had consistent dimensions. Ships on the channel heard his order before he gave it. Ships on the channel heard his order from directions that did not exist. Some ships heard nothing, because the space between them and the resolve of Tides had been quietly folded shut like a letter. 9 seconds. That was how long it lasted. From the first disappearance to the last. 9 seconds of a fleet dying not in fire, but in geometry. The way a drawing dies when you fold the paper. Then it stopped. Idris was alive. The resolve of Tides was intact. Around him, 1,203 other ships floated in space that had become normal again, or at least navigable. His instruments worked. His coordinates made sense. Sol burned steady in the forward display. 38,796 ships were gone. The 1,204 survivors had not been lucky. Yidris understood this with the cold clarity of a man who had just watched physics become a weapon and a mercy in the same 9 seconds. The survivors were arranged in a perfect geometric pattern, evenly spaced, carefully positioned. They had been selected, preserved. The same force that had folded 38,000 ships out of existence had folded protective space around the survivors, holding them safe while the universe rearranged itself. They were saved by the thing that killed everyone else. Then the message arrived. Every surviving ship received it simultaneously. A data packet, large, dense, and formatted in Concord Standard. Yidris opened it on his personal display and read its contents while his hands trembled, and the ship around him creaked with the residual stress of having been gently held by a god. The packet contained full technical schematics, complete, verified. The entire system that had just killed 38,000 ships, laid out in documentation so thorough and so clearly written that a first-year engineering student could follow it. The humans were giving away the weapon, freely, without conditions. Attached to the schematics was a note, short, written in Concord Standard, with no errors. So you understand this was a choice, not a limitation. We could have met you at the border. We wanted you to see the house first. Yidris read it 3 times. Then he opened his personal log, the one that would be sealed and classified and buried for 300 years, and he recorded his final entry. Half the words came out in his native Thessari, a language of water sounds and low clicks. But the last sentence translated clean. They aren't trapped in here with us. We are guests in something we don't have a word for. He closed the log. He set a course for Concord space. Around him, 1,203 ships did the same, moving in formation through space that the humans had politely returned to normal, like a host smoothing the rug after a guest has stumbled. In his quarters that night, while the fleet limped home through stars that would never look the same to him, Idris wrote a letter to his daughter. He told her he would make it to her emergence ceremony. He told her he loved her. He did not tell her what had happened. He did not have the words, in any language, for what he had seen. He had seen a species catch a fist mid-swing, open its fingers, and place a flower in its palm. He did not know what to call that. He was not sure anyone ever would. The chamber was built for 4,000 voices, and today every seat was full. Then stood at the speaker's podium, in the center of the Concord's Grand Assembly Hall. A vast circular room designed to make whoever stood at its center feel exactly as small as they were. Tiers of seats rose around her in concentric rings, filled with representatives of species she had studied in school, species she had never heard of, species so old they had been part of the Concord before some of the younger member worlds had developed fire. The light in the chamber was calibrated to be comfortable for every visual spectrum simultaneously, which meant it was slightly wrong for all of them. Her wing scales were falling steadily. She had given up trying to hide it. The fleet action was not a battle, she said. Her voice carried through translation systems that rendered her words into 4,000 languages in real time. It was a demonstration. The humans allowed the fleet to enter their space, navigate deep into their territory, and reach weapons range of their homeworld. They did this deliberately. They wanted the fleet to see what it was standing inside before they closed the door. The chamber was not silent. 4,000 species murmured and shifted and processed in their own ways. But beneath the noise, then felt a deeper quiet. The quiet of people who already knew what she was about to say. 38,796 ships were lost in 9 seconds, she continued. 1,204 were deliberately preserved. The survivors were not lucky. They were chosen, protected by the same spatial restructuring that destroyed the rest of the fleet. The humans killed and saved in the same gesture. She paused. In the third tier, Counselor Reth Mahan sat in his water chair and watched her with all four eyes. He looked old. He looked relieved. These were, then suspected, the same thing for him now. Following the action, she said, the humans transmitted full technical schematics of the spatial manipulation technology to every surviving ship. The schematics have been verified by Concord Science Division as complete and functional. The humans gave away the most powerful technology in recorded galactic history. They attached no conditions. They asked for nothing in return. The murmur grew. In the upper tiers, where the newer species sat, the sound was confused. In the lower tiers, where the ancient species sat, the sound was something else. Recognition. Shame. Ven had rehearsed the next part. She had written it 7 times, and deleted it 6. In the end, she decided to just say it the way Torvand had said it to her, plain and simple and without decoration, because the truth did not need help. 3 days after the fleet action, a human diplomat arrived at Concord Central Station. In a single ship. Unarmed. She let that sit. The diplomat was received by the Emergency Security Council in closed session. No record of the meeting was kept. What I am about to tell you comes from the personal testimony of Counselor Reth Mahan, who was present as a junior analyst and who has authorized me to share his account. She looked at Reth. He gave a small nod, a Thesari gesture that involved closing his lower eyes while keeping the upper pair open. It meant, go ahead, I'm done carrying it. The human diplomat presented 5 terms, then said. The first 4 were as follows. She read them from her notes, though she had memorized them weeks ago. 1. Human space would be self-voided on all Concord star charts. Humanity would remove itself from galactic affairs entirely. 2. No species would enter human space. No trade, no communication, no contact of any kind. In exchange, humanity would not interact with the Concord in any capacity. 4. The Concord would not disclose the events of the fleet action to any species. The void would remain unexplained. The chamber was truly quiet now. Not murmuring, not shifting. The quiet of 4,000 species holding their breath. These terms were accepted by the Emergency Security Council in 9 minutes, then said. She had practiced saying this without emotion. She failed. Her voice cracked on the word 9, and she let it crack, because the number deserved the weight. The extermination vote took 11 minutes. The peace vote took 9. I will let you sit with that. She did not look at the delegations from the 11 species that had contributed ships. She did not need to. The chamber's attention had already turned to them with the slow, crushing weight of collective judgment. The 4 terms were reasonable, then said. Some might say generous, given that the Concord had just attempted to erase a species from existence, and the species in question had responded by demonstrating that it could erase the Concord instead. The terms asked for nothing except distance. No reparations, no punishment, no apology, just silence and space. She set down her notes. There was a 5th term. The chamber shifted. This was new. Even the ancient delegations, the ones who had sat in knowing silence through the first 4 terms, reacted. Then saw bodies adjust, eyes widen, sensory organs orient toward her with the sudden focus of predators catching a scent. The 5th term was delivered verbally, then said. It was never recorded. It was shared between the human diplomat and the members of the Emergency Security Council, and it has been carried in silence by the surviving members for 312 years. She turned to Reth. The old Thesari rose from his water chair. It took effort. His body was heavy with age and fluid, and the calcium that was slowly turning his lungs to stone. He moved to the podium with the careful dignity of someone who knows that standing costs them something they will not get back. Ven stepped aside. Reth placed his hands on the podium. They were large and gray and steady, and Ven realized that they were steady because this was the moment he had been waiting for. Not dreading, waiting. The way a man waits for the end of a long and difficult journey, not because the destination is pleasant, but because walking is no longer possible. The human diplomat was not what we expected, Reth said. His voice was deep, water-thick, built for chambers like this one. We expected anger. We expected demands. We expected a conqueror, because that is what we understood. That is the only framework the Concord has ever operated within. Power is used. It is leveraged. It is traded and threatened and wielded. This is how 4,200 species have organized themselves for 11,000 years. He paused. The diplomat was calm, patient, spoke perfect Concord standard, spoke it better than most of us in the room, presented the 4 terms clearly and without hostility, the way you might explain house rules to a neighbor. We accepted because we were terrified, but the diplomat did not seem to notice our fear, or perhaps did not consider it relevant. Another pause. Reth's upper eyes swept the chamber, then watched 4,000 species watch him back. After the terms were accepted, Reth said, the diplomat stood, prepared to leave, then paused, leaned forward, and said the following in a voice I have heard every night for 40 years. The chamber was so quiet that Ven could hear her own wing scales hitting the floor. The diplomat said, "We know about the vote. We counted." Reth let the words land. The sound that moved through the chamber was not a gasp. It was deeper and quieter than that. A collective exhale. The sound of 4,000 species understanding something at the same time. The humans knew. They had always known. They knew exactly how long the galaxy had taken to decide they should die, and they knew it was 11 minutes, and they knew it was item 7 on a 14-item agenda, and they had carried that knowledge into a room with the people who had tried to kill them, and they had offered peace anyway. Not because they were weak, not because they were naive, not because they had to, because they chose to. That was the 5th term, not a condition, not a demand, a single sentence that said, "We know what you are, and we are choosing this anyway, and we will remember exactly how long it took you to decide we should die, and we will carry that number forever, and we are still choosing this." Reth stepped back from the podium. He returned to his water chair and sank into it with the slow collapse of a structure that has done its final work. Then returned to the podium. She had more to say. She had prepared remarks about accountability, about the need for a formal review of the Concord's historical actions, about reforming the classification system that had made the voiding possible. She said none of it. She looked at the chamber. 4,000 species, 11,000 years of civilization, and at the center of their proudest achievement, their grand alliance of order and cooperation, was an 11-minute vote to murder a species that had done nothing wrong, and a 300-year silence to hide it. "I have no recommendations," Ven said. "I came here with a list of proposals for institutional reform. I'm not going to read them. They seem very small right now." She gathered her notes. Wing scales scattered from the podium like confetti at a funeral no one had meant to attend. From the back of the chamber, a voice rose, young, uncertain, a junior delegate from a species Ven did not recognize, something small and furred with enormous dark eyes that reflected the chamber's light like wet stones. "What are they doing in there?" the delegate asked. The question was simple. The voice was not. It carried the weight of every unanswered question the Concord had been too afraid to ask for 3 centuries. In 312 years, what have they become? The chamber waited. Nobody answered. Reth closed his eyes, all 4 of them, and in the darkness behind them, he saw the human diplomat's face, patient and calm, and carrying a wound so deep it had become architecture. And he thought about a species that had been sentenced to death in 11 minutes, and had turned that wound into a door they chose not to walk through. What had they become? He was afraid to find out. He was more afraid that no one ever would. 6 months, changed the galaxy more than the previous 3 centuries had. The declassification was partial, sanitized, stripped of the technical schematics and the worst of the fleet recordings. It did not matter. Enough got out. Within weeks, the Concorde's careful architecture of silence collapsed the way old buildings collapse. Not all at once, but in a sequence of failures, each one making the next one inevitable. Species that had sat comfortably in the Concorde for millennia began asking questions that had no comfortable answers. Species that had joined in the last 300 years, born into a galaxy where Sol was simply voided and no one discussed it, discovered that the foundation of their alliance was built on a mass grave that nobody had bothered to dig. The 11 species that had contributed ships to Fleet Action 4712-01 faced formal inquiries. Delegations were recalled. Trade agreements were suspended. Alliances that had endured for centuries cracked along lines that had always been there, but had been papered over by the shared project of forgetting. Ven watched it happen from the inside. She had been appointed to the Contact Committee, a newly formed body of 12 species, tasked with answering the question the junior delegate had asked in the Grand Assembly. What have they become? What do we do about it? Should the Concorde attempt communication with human space after 312 years of silence? The committee met weekly in a small conference room on the station's mid-ring, a room chosen for its lack of surveillance feeds and its proximity to a food court, because diplomacy ran on argument and argument ran on snacks. 12 species sat around a table that was too small for all of them, and they disagreed about everything. The Thessari delegation wanted to send a probe. Unmanned, expendable. A gesture of curiosity that risked nothing biological. The Cathari delegation, Ven's own people, wanted a formal diplomatic mission, full honors, a show of respect that acknowledged the Concorde's debt. The Pelori wanted to do nothing, arguing that the arrangement was still in effect, and that poking a sleeping god was a poor strategy, regardless of how much institutional guilt one felt. Ven listened to all of them, and agreed with none of them. She sat in her chair, which was too tall for her frame, and shed wing scales onto the conference table, and said very little, because she had learned in the last 6 months that the people who talked the most about the humans understood them the least. She understood them. Not fully, not in the way you understand a friend or a culture you have lived inside. She understood them, the way you understand a wound you share. She knew what it was to be dismissed, to be filed away, to be made small by systems too large to fight, and too indifferent to notice the damage. She knew the taste of that, and she knew what it cost to swallow it and keep walking. And she knew that the humans had swallowed 11 minutes and 40,000 ships and had kept walking for 312 years. She did not know what they had become. She was fairly certain that whatever it was, the Concorde's frameworks could not hold it. On the morning of the 184th day after the Grand Assembly, the signal arrived. It came from Sol, from the voided space that had been silent for 312 years. It arrived on the same frequencies the human diplomat had used 3 centuries ago, encoded in the same Concorde standard formatting, as if someone had kept the channel open this entire time, waiting for the right moment to speak. The signal reached Concorde Central Station at 0347 hours. Ven was asleep in her quarters when her console lit up with priority alerts. She dressed without thinking, pulling on a diplomatic robe that she realized too late was inside out, and ran to the committee's conference room, trailing wing scales down 3 corridors like a breadcrumb trail for some fairy tale she half remembered from childhood. The committee was already assembling. Species arrived in various states of preparedness. The Thessari delegate's water suit was leaking. The Pelori delegate had not put on all of her legs. The room smelled of adrenaline and reheated food and the ozone tang of translation systems working overtime. The signal was not a message. Ven stared at the display where the decoded contents rotated in holographic projection, and tried to make her brain accept what she was seeing. It was a star chart. A navigational path through the voided space, plotted with a precision that made Concord cartography look like cave painting. Every jump point, every gravitational lane, every spatial fold was marked and annotated in Concord standard with the care of someone who wanted to be understood. The path began at the border of voided space and wound inward through Sol system and beyond, past Earth, past the outer planets, past the edge of the heliosphere, into a region of space that Concord charts showed as empty. It was an invitation. Open, clear, unambiguous. Ven's hands were shaking. She pressed them flat on the table to hide it, and wing scales slipped from between her fingers like secrets. "There's a second layer," the committee's data analyst said. A Druisi, young by their standards only 80. Her crystalline hands moved through the hologram, peeling back the chart's surface data to reveal metadata embedded beneath the navigation coordinates. "It's encrypted in Concord Standard Tier 3. Whoever sent this wanted us to be able to read it without help." The room went still. It was a census. A population count of human space, current, dated to the present standard year, comprehensive, every colony, every station, every habitat, every outpost, every ship. Total population, 0. Not declining, not evacuated, not estimated, 0. The census was not a report of absence, it was a report of completion. Every entry was marked with a status code that the analyst translated after several attempts as something close to transitioned. Not dead, not departed, transitioned. Then stared at the number, her wings locked against her back. Around the table, 12 species processed the information in 12 different ways, and all of them arrived at the same conclusion at the same time. Humanity had not been hiding behind the wall for 312 years. They had been changing. The topology warping technology, the spatial restructuring that had folded a fleet like paper, was not a weapon. It was not infrastructure. It was a cocoon. Humanity had wrapped itself in the fabric of space-time, and had done something inside that cocoon that the Concord science could not describe. Because the Concord science was built on the assumption that intelligent life existed in three-dimensional space and moved through time in one direction and occupied bodies made of matter. The census said 0 because there was no one left to count. Not because they were gone, because the unit of measurement no longer applied. "They outgrew it," Ven said. Her voice was very quiet. "They outgrew the space. They outgrew the bodies. They outgrew everything we use to define what a species is, and then they sent us a map back." The room was silent. Ven looked at the star chart, still rotating in its holographic display. The path wound through space that had been forbidden for 3 centuries, past worlds that had held 11 billion people who had been sentenced to death by a committee vote, and had responded by becoming something the committee could not kill, because it could not comprehend. She noticed something. The chart was beautiful. Not functionally beautiful, not elegant in its efficiency beautiful. Actually, intentionally, artistically beautiful. The navigation lines curved in patterns that suggested care. The annotations were placed with an eye for balance. Someone, or something, that had transcended three-dimensional space and biological existence, had taken the time to make this chart pleasant to look at. This was the detail that broke her. Not the power, not the transcendence, not the 312 years of silence, or the 0 on the census. The fact that whatever humanity had become, it still cared about making something pretty for visitors. It still thought about the people who would receive this chart, and wanted them to find it pleasing. In the mathematics of post-human existence, someone had budgeted for aesthetics. Ven's eyes burned. Wing scales fell from her shoulders in a steady cascade, more than she had ever shed at once, and she did not wipe them away. The junior delegate from the Grand Assembly, the small furred one with the dark wet eyes, was on the committee now. He sat at the far end of the table and looked at Ven with an expression she could read, even across species lines. It was the look of someone standing at the edge of something vast, and being asked to step forward. "What do we do?" he asked. Then looked at the map, the invitation, the open door. She thought about Torvald, dead now, his crystalline shell returned to the mineral cycle of his homeworld. She thought about Reth still alive, barely, breathing through lungs that were more calcium than tissue. She thought about Commander Idris, dead for 2 centuries, who had watched physics fold his fleet like paper, and had written a letter to his daughter about an emergence ceremony. She thought about 9 seconds, and 11 minutes, and 3 words, and 312 years. She thought about a species that had been sentenced to death between a trade dispute and a budget line, and had responded by becoming something so far beyond the reach of the galaxy that tried to kill them, that the only gesture left was to send back a pretty map and leave the door open. Not a threat, not a lesson, not revenge, an invitation. "We go," Ven said. The committee stared at her. "We accept the invitation," she said. "We follow the map. We go see what they left for us." "It could be a trap," the Pelori delegate said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It's not a trap," Ven said. She was certain of this. She was certain the way you are certain of something you understand in your body before your mind catches up. They sent schematics after destroying a fleet. They gave away the weapon. They asked for peace after being sentenced to death. They made the map beautiful. She stood, wing scales scattered from her chair. A species that makes a map beautiful for the people who tried to kill them is not setting a trap. They're holding a door open. And we owe it to every ship that folded in those 9 seconds, and every minute of those 11 minutes, and every year of those 312 years, to walk through it. The chamber was quiet. The map turned in the light, patient and lovely, waiting. Then stepped forward. Not because she was brave, not because she was certain, not because she had been chosen, or appointed, or destined for this moment, because she was the one who asked. And 300 light-years away, in space that used to hold a species, and now held something else entirely, something vast, and patient, and unimaginably kind. A door that had been open for a very long time, waited for the galaxy to stop being afraid, and walk through. It had always been open. The humans had never closed it.